Good afternoon, Michael Kofman. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for hosting me. Thanks for the kind invitation.
Well, there are a lot of things I would like to say to introduce you to the listeners who might not be familiar with your work, but I'm not sure I would do it justice. So I'll just give you your official title, which is Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is an international affairs think tank based in Washington, D.C., one of the most influential in the United States, if I may say so, after holding many other titles, but most notably being a fellow at the Kennan Institute. This is what you were when the war started, if I'm not mistaken.
It was one of my affiliations. To be honest, I had several, including being a fellow at Center for New American Security. But my primary job when the war began was being director of the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis, which is one of the principal defense research organizations in the United States for the Navy and Marine Corps. And at that time, I was leading a team of analysts on Russia, particularly military analysts. And I'm very proud of that program I happened to build and had moved to Carnegie about 2 years ago, I guess now, in summer of 2023.
You're also a fellow podcaster, most notably in the excellent War on the Rocks podcast with Ryan Evans, a show and a website that I often reference here, and which happens to be a partner of Le Rubicon, but also in your brilliant podcast titled The Russia Contingency, which is behind the War on the Rocks paywall, but well worth the expense in my opinion. In short, you are and have been one of the world's leading experts on Russian military capabilities for years and have certainly become one of the most influential analysts on the war in Ukraine since its start or restart in February of 2022, in part because you actually go there quite often on the front line. And, well, those are always very illuminating episodes when you're coming back from these field trips. So it's a real pleasure to have you in studio, having personally listened and read you for a number of years now. So, all this was a bit mundane, and all of this could have been gathered from a Google search. But so I'd like to let you tell us a little more about it to understand your background and where your focus on Russian military capabilities come from. I might just add that you were born and partly raised in Ukraine, which might be or not relevant when discussing this war. And so how and when did you come to study the Russian military?
Sure. I think briefly I was quite interested in international security when I was young and got my initial degree in international relations and then particularly in security studies in grad school, secondary degree. And I will say that this was during a time period with the main focus, certainly in the United States, and amongst those studying security in the United States was very much on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, stability operations, and what people called low-intensity conflict limited war. This is the early 2000s and the mid-2000s. And I, for some reason, really held an interest in traditional conventional warfare, questions pertaining to advanced weapons proliferation, nuclear strategy, evolution, nuclear weapons, what have you, which may seem today to those studying topics under the general rubric of security studies or strategic studies as the obvious things to study. But they were not at that time period. In the 1990s, people focused on peacekeeping, peace enforcement, various types of internal conflicts. And in 2000s, it was more these types of subjects. And I just was far more interested in conventional warfare and the subject matter. And I also, yes, naturally being originally from the Soviet Union and from Ukraine, at least had the language skills and the inclination, and this region was largely ignored. I will be frank that there wasn't much of an interest to this time period in Russia or many of the countries that emerged from the dissolution of the Soviet Union either, to be perfectly honest. And so from my point of view, my interest kind of gravitated there. And I would be a liar if I said that people were particularly interested in this area of study prior to 2014. They were not. I also worked extensively at National Defense University on the wars that we had, which were Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. So it's not as though I didn't do that, but I also try to keep an interest in this. And at the time when I was trying to follow it, to tell you truthfully, much of the field had degenerated in terms of military analysts who specialized in the Russian military. Many of them were experts on the Soviet armed forces. So a large number of them had already retired, and many others had either left or converted in the field to something else. They'd become experts on terrorism, experts on counterinsurgency, maybe they went and studied more the Chinese military or emerging questions on cybersecurity, cyber warfare. But there wasn't much of an analytical presence in the field, I would say.
But speaking about the field, did you go a lot for research in Russia? That's to say, at that time, obviously it's sort of closed up afterwards, and now it's completely closed for most people at least. But, well, did you sort of study the Russian military up close, or was it always more a focus on maybe the states that emerged from the Soviet Union, but not so much Russia?
So, at that time, I had gone to Ukraine, but we did go, I and other analysts, including many European colleagues at different defense research programs here, who focused on the Russian forces, did go to Russia and were able to do so, although under increasing constraints as the relationship soured.
Starting in the 2010s or even before that?
Yeah, well, there was a degree of military-to-military cooperation between the United States and Russia. I actually remember this.
And you were sort of perceived as a representative of the U.S. military at that time?
I was in the Department of Defense at National Defense University for almost 7 years. So to be clear, I was actually in civil service in the Department of Defense during some of the times I went to Russia in that time period. And we had military engagement, particularly military education. There was even, I remember, visits by Russia's Moscow Academy of General Staff that came to National Defense University. And there was a brief period of renewed activity during the reset after the Russia-Georgia war, right? So
to be clear, reset was after 2008. Barack Obama, like so many before him, after him,
that's right,
thought that he could reset relationships with Russia. And so here goes the visits.
That's right, yeah. To quote one of my favorite lines from Samuel Johnson about second marriages, which are the triumph of hope over experience. So that would be my commentary on the perpetual efforts to reset relations with Russia. But and so I remember there was a degree of military activity, and so for some time we were able to go to Russia. Obviously, I and many other folks, including much of my team at the Center for Naval Analysis, were formally sanctioned by Russia some years back. So I, amongst many other colleagues in the field, are formally banned and won't be able to go for some time. Not that we would want it, to be frank. But we had the opportunity to at least interact with members of the Russian military, members of our strategic community. And it was beneficial, I would say, although there were certain points, I would also add, when things had soured so much and Russian behavior became so reprehensible that I myself and others were very much doubting the further value and benefit of any sustained engagements. But at the same time, our knowledge, our input and exposure to the thinking of an adversary was getting so constrained that you were constantly weighing these risks, right? And then they weren't. I would say that everybody made or chose their own path at the time. I definitely saw that the trajectory we were on with Russia as a revanchist state in Europe at the time, that the security environment had changed quite a bit, and we were kind of catching up to it after 2014, 2015. And addably, there was frankly a period where a number of us were talking about Russian military reform, Russian military modernization, and the national security and defense establishment was fundamentally not interested in seeing Russia as a threat or as a problem set. Just the political determination had not been made until 2014. And so a lot of these things were dismissed as things that we shouldn't care about until the Russian seizure and annexation of Crimea and the launch of the war against Ukraine in 2014. That's when things began to change.
But how much did it change? I mean, so that's 8 years of the war starting, of the war being conducted. How interested was Washington? Basically, were you just let to do whatever you did before and just your memos were a bit more read? Or was there like a real concern, a real focus on Russian military capabilities, on its successes? I mean, what was the mood at that time, and how impactful was your research back then?
It's hard to say how impactful anyone's research is.
Well, you can tell you can tell if what you write is read or not.
You'd like to think so, but you never know. Sometimes when you're writing or when you're speaking, you think that you're doing it for an audience of one, maybe, like who is really reading your work. But What I will say is that there was renewed interest in Russia and the Russian military, but if people have the sense that suddenly the spigot was open in terms of funding for research and interest in the Russian armed forces, not really. I think that there was a degree of restoration of analytical capability on Russia, but most of the funding was still focused on China, Chinese armed forces, and other challenges. And that folks like I and others had the opportunity to do research, and I think it was impactful at the time, and helped to regenerate parts of the field. But we're always constrained by interest, by resources. A lot of the defense research ecosystem, unfortunately, is very focused on specific types of questions, like adversary military capabilities, and tends to narrow the areas of study you can pursue, and the other ones are kind of just as important, but they're maybe more your interests. There wasn't nearly as much interest in lessons learned from Russian combat operations in Ukraine in 2014, 2015, and very little interest in Ukrainian armed forces. I would dare anyone to name the experts on the Ukrainian military that they know from the years of 2014 to 2022 in the West. Okay, let's say in the United States, or let's say here in France.
Was that you?
No, I wouldn't have called myself. I would not have called myself an expert on the Ukrainian military. I and my team were focused on Russia as an adversary, and most of the research done was to deal with with adversary forces, right? And Ukraine was seen as a partner country, and I think the interest, unfortunately, was quite low. So when folks asked later, how come we didn't have better expertise in Ukrainian armed forces? My answer was, how come you didn't fund any of that expertise that didn't lead to the development of any experts, you know? So my frank answer had been, listen, you get the research you pay for. More accurately, you don't get the research that you don't pay for, right? And if you don't fund anything, if you don't fund the development of a field, if you don't invest in expertise, then when a crisis comes around, when a conflict comes around, don't be surprised that you don't suddenly have it, okay? And the people that will emerge right off the bat, and many will emerge at the start of a war and say, hey, listen to me, I'm an expert in the Russia-Ukraine military. The odds that they are, and they've been in hiding this whole time, are not great.
So how does this very dissymmetric knowledge of the Russian and the Ukrainian military, how do you think it informed the sort of assessment, if not gambling, made by the West and Washington especially, in February 2022, which means the assessment that Russia might not attack? Well, the US was a bit first, warning everybody else that it might actually happen. Still, it came pretty late compared to all the, if you think of all the crises in the years and the months before. So how do you think the strategic assessment in Washington mostly was shaped by sort of this imperfect knowledge of the Russian and most importantly of the Ukrainian military?
Okay. So there are a couple of questions in what you've put forward. First, I will disagree a bit. I think that in terms of indications and warnings and knowledge of the impending Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the United States and U.S. intelligence community performed remarkably. And that knowledge, I think, was beginning to be disseminated to European allies and partners at some point in November, which is more than 4 months in advance of the war. That certain European allies like France and Germany didn't believe it or had a different interpretation of the evidence is a different story. But I think in correctly assessing Russian intentions and then organizing an interagency process and then getting allies on board with responding to it, the U.S. did really well in this war. And it was a night and day comparison with how we performed in 2014 during the initial invasion in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. Okay, so there I think the community and in general the folks following Russian military deserve a lot of credit. Now, if we talk about assessments, the challenge is always like whose assessment? I'm talking about the intelligence community. I'm not a member of it. I know I happen to be accessible. You can get me on a podcast as opposed to a senior intel analyst who may have done the assessment. But that doesn't mean that you're actually getting anybody who was involved in it. That said, I've also heard plenty of people reference U.S. intelligence assessment who I don't believe have ever had access to it or had any opportunity to see it either. So you can balance both of those comments however you want. If we look at what folks in the U.S. thought, the first problem was that the U.S. was very focused at the time on getting a consensus and warning people this was going to happen, because large parts of our own system didn't believe that this was true. Meaning in the U.S. government, there are many people that simply didn't believe that whatever the intelligence said, that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. And many European allies didn't either, okay? And so there was a strong impetus to warn. And then the second question was, well, what was the scenario? Because, you may believe that Russia will invade Ukraine, but your version of the invasion will differ from mine, okay? There were plenty of Ukrainian colleagues who thought that maybe if the invasion would take place, it would only be focused on the Donbass, and there would not be a full-scale invasion of the country. In fact, that's the bet that they largely made on the 9th invasion.
There's a infamous RAND study a few months back from the invasion, which laid pretty precisely the Russian maneuver that happened in February 2022 with the 3 axes of attack. But the thing is, it's one study in an ocean of different studies who had different assessments. But some people kind of predicted it.
Well, okay, RAND study was just a focus of a study of what would look like if the Russian military had solely invaded Ukraine's Donbass, and that was their operational goal. But that wasn't what the Russian invasion of Ukraine looked like, both from a military operational perspective, from the standpoint of base political goals. Right. So we'll go back to it in a second, but just to kind of reflect on this, and that study postulated, if I remember, kind of a limited Russian operation with a sizable number of forces. And what's interesting is that I think a lot of folks, including myself, saw the likely Russian invasion, the way it was going to be executed, as essentially a two-pronged assault, with one part of the Russian forces trying to envelop the Donbass and half of the Ukrainian military deployed there, which is a substantial percentage of Ukrainian forces were deployed in Ukraine's east. And then the other coming down to Kiev and trying to encircle Kiev and sever kind of the center of political decision-making from the rest of the country to create a degree of paralysis, and then try to, then seize much of the rest of the country from there. And I can lay it out further, but the way I think these things unfolded is that eventually we came to see that the Russian intentions were a much larger full-scale invasion, and that regime change was at the heart of the Russian objectives, that it wasn't just going to be about the Donbass. What I think was a big challenge was trying to figure out how they're going to execute. And there, when you don't know what the adversary's intentions are because you don't have this knowledge, right? And here you can fault different intelligence services for not having a complete and perfect laydown of the Russian plans, but you should never expect and assume that you're going to have this. The natural path was to kind of rationalize and say, okay, well, what are the best courses of action for the Russian military? How could they execute it? What would doctrine suggest they would do, and so on and so forth. But we now know, and we have great evidence regarding to Russian planning, and I've gone through much of this, both through interviews, we have primary sources, we actually have lots of captured documents with clear orders, so it's not guesswork for us what happened at the beginning of the war. Like, this is, we can debate it, but the preponderance of evidence leads one to a certain set of conclusions, and that evidence is quite substantial. You yourself are military historians, so I'm sure you understand when there's stacks of primary source evidence and interviews that begin to align, painting a certain picture. So it's clear now that the Russian invasion was meant to be complementary to an intelligence operation that they had thought and assumed had set the conditions for a coup de main. And they had largely presumed that the Ukrainian military resistance would quickly collapse. In some ways, this operation was a much larger version of the seizure of Crimea. In other ways, you could think of it as an attempt to, replicate Operation Danube, the invasion and regime change operation against Czechoslovakia. But the way they saw it, they had naturally translated the assumptions of the political leadership. There's Putin's assumptions about Ukraine, many of which he laid out in an article back in the summer of 2021, for those who are interested in reading it. If you go back to it, it's remarkable.
I've been talking about it a long time. It really is a very, very bad history dissertation. So when you have been a teacher, and I've read actually history dissertations, it has all the traits of a bad one from a bad student who thinks he knows a lot of things very penetrating about deep history of his country and doesn't come up with much. And
It also shows that he hadn't learned much from 2014. Actually, it shows a remarkable lack of learning about Ukraine and Ukrainian society, and a failure to at all evolve or properly react to adverse information. And so it seemed like a lot of those assumptions had stayed over the course of those years. But the military operation by itself, from a military strategy perspective, didn't make much sense, right? It was based on key political assumptions and the belief that they'd set the conditions what they had. And honestly, on the underestimation of the Ukrainian will to fight and ability to resist. But it also was very heavily leveraged from a standpoint of military operations, meaning it privileged speed. It involved a fairly brittle force without much ability to sustain combat operations if there was any substantial resistance. It involved an initial strike campaign that was quite limited in terms of its objectives and munitions used and all that. And it was kind of intent to shock Ukrainian leadership and believing that they could achieve decisive effects and lead to a very quick collapse of Ukrainian military resistance and then move to a stabilization phase. And because of that, the Russian military didn't strike many of the things that I think I and other analysts thought they would, both from a training, doctrine, and other perspective. And in general, the operation was executed in a way that was quite different from the way Russian military trained and organized to fight, or any military, really, if you looked at how they ran it. I mean, in key parts of it, they had National Guard in the lead, particularly riot police, intending to immediately go into cities and begin to stabilize. I mean, it would have been very difficult to predict that, or even to war game it, or to simulate it prior to the war, or assume that this is how they would execute it, right?
So this is the strategy and the ground Russian plan who proved ultimately flawed. But so you're an expert on the Russian military and its tactics and its equipment. One question would be, what did you learn about the Russian military itself during this invasion? What have you that you didn't know? Well, obviously, it's an army that changed a great deal ever since 2022, but what did you learn in 2022 that you didn't expect from a technical or even tactical perspective on the Russian army?
Sure. A couple of things. But first what I want to say was, and I have a great Israeli friend, and he often on panels with me likes to say, I'd like to answer the question I wasn't asked, right?
Yeah,
and
sure.
I've picked up this habit from maybe it's a bad habit.
Please do.
But first, I want to answer a question that you didn't ask, but maybe you will at some point, which was on estimation of how this fight will resolve. And what I'll tell you is two things. First, the biggest deficit of knowledge actually was on the Ukrainian side of the equation. And those who were close and most familiar with the Ukrainian forces actually, and interacted with them quite a bit, were rather pessimistic based on interactions with them, given their low level of preparation and the fact that it didn't seem like political leadership was really making a lot of the right decisions in the run-up to the war. To some extent, the political military leadership wasn't fully convinced that this war was going to happen, and even if it was, there was a strong sense that it would just be localized to the Donbass. But in general, I saw in myself, my own community, and I see it in retrospect, a strong information bias. More was known about the Russian forces, about Russian plans, than about Ukrainian plans to defend. Okay, and I reflect on it now, looking back, that if in some respects we certainly overestimated the Russian military and their ability to execute, and I'll get to your part of the question in a minute, you have to keep in mind that actually the real deficit of knowledge was on the Ukrainian armed forces and what plans they had to defend.
Why is that? Since they were somewhat allied, is that just nobody bothered to ask them?
We ran through that just a bit earlier in the podcast because there was not that nobody bothered to ask them, but there was very little known about their actual plan, and there are reasons for that. But also, I think knowledge on Ukrainian military and the state was very weak. Part of the reason for that is the Ukrainian military had also substantially reformed and transformed from 2014 to 2022. It evolved considerably as a force. And there was a very reasonable debate as to what it could do. And most importantly, you can know as much as possible to know about one military or even another military, okay? But having knowledge, good knowledge, on the militaries involved does not mean you're going to be great at predicting how a particular war is going to unfold because there are way too many variables. History, particularly military history, is highly contingent. There are so many variables to reconcile. Every war is a context of its own. Political objectives, military strategy that flows from, the geography in which it is fought, the different breaks, how the fight goes for the forces in particular battles, right? Like from individual choices of commanders to luck to all sorts of things that play out in a battle.
There's a great counterfactual to make about what happens if Hostomel holds, if the Russians hold Hostomel for a few hours or a few days. And they do this aerial bridge and they resupply basically inside Kiev. That's a good story, counterfactual story to write.
Yeah, I wrote an article some years back on War on the Rocks about the Battle of Hostomel and how critical that was in the first 36 hours of the war. And what if that battle went differently? What if a couple other battles went differently? The story could play different. So bottom line is, I think the more I've learned about the original history and how this war unfolded, the clearer it became to me that it was quite contingent. Actually, in a number of cases, quite damn close, and that, to be frank, it's still unclear to me if we're living in the most probabilistic timeline of events. I think as human beings, we naturally judge that whatever happened was the likeliest course of events to take place, especially if it played out the way we wanted it to, right? But we rarely assume that we're living in a 20-30% probability of how events would have unfolded as well. We don't do a good enough job of reflecting on it.
Which means if we play this war 100 times, how many times does Ukraine get off that well? How many times do Russians do better, etc.? Sure.
And would our vision and kind of the story we tell about this war be different if a series of events, the way the dice, let's say, came up, I'm being a bit simplistic here, in the first couple of weeks, if they came up differently, how will we be telling this war back to ourselves now? Fortunately, we're not, but I'm just saying that it's important for us to also have a historical perspective on this as well, that the outcome as it happened, I don't think was that overdetermined as people would like to believe it was. But lastly, that ultimately, it's very hard to translate knowledge into knowing exactly what the outcomes of all these battles and choices will be. You at best can estimate it and try to fill uncertainty with with how best you can. And it's a great conversation that emerged later of how do we fill uncertainty and gaps in knowledge. Last point on this, and I have this back and forth often with colleagues from military historians. When you're an analyst on the war, you don't have the archives. You don't know how the war ends. You can't go back to see what everybody did, what they thought. You don't have access to all these things. You have very big gaps in knowledge and plans, right? So from a historical point of view, it's much easier to talk about the war once it's happened and you know how these things played out. When you're actually in it and you're in the moment trying to figure out what's going on, you have a lot of gaps, and you have a lot of things that you even have blind spots. We all as analysts have blind spots. Okay, briefly, what have I learned about the Russian war? So first, it was clear from the outset of the war, and even if you accept what I said, that the initial invasion, the first month of it, from February 24th till about March 25th, was this attempt to generally conduct this ridiculous operation that Putin thought was going to work. And I guess Russian intelligence sold to him that this was possible, and the Russian military agreed and said they could do it. But let's say afterwards, let's say much of the war that follows afterwards, what I think I saw right off the bat was first, that in terms of organizational capacity, the software of the military, the Russian armed forces were quite weak. They had not the experience or the maturity with the capabilities they had acquired, and they really struggled to employ their forces at scale. They struggled to translate theory into practice. They did much in that we saw in exercise in the run-up to the war. We saw a limited case of force employment during the Russian intervention in Syria. And I think in many cases, you have to best guesstimate, well, what could this force do at a larger scale? And this is something you never know about the military. Can they do these things or can they not? And when the military tries to scale the use of forces, thousands of men, broad front, what have you, a lot of things break. And will they be able to recover? Will they be able to adjust? Or will they not? And
that's why you practice, and that's why you practice at a large scale, which the Russians paradoxically do a lot. Do. But it's also known that they don't do it very well because it's heavily scripted.
Yes.
So how much do you think it's what showed up at that point?
So here's a challenge. So somebody who covered Russian Strategic Command Staff exercise extensively, and still for those who are interested in my old website, Russia Military Analysis on WordPress, I think they're all still up there and recorded. We knew they were heavily scripted, okay? And discussed that extensively, that the problem was actually we couldn't tell that much from Russian large-scale exercises what the force could really do. And a lot of that force had also been substantially reshaped following periods of Russian military reform and modernization. So an often tendency in defense analysis to worst-case things, right? You have to assume that adversaries will be able to do the things they can because you can't just walk into a room and say, hey, I have good news. You know, they have these capabilities. They have this force, but I'm pretty sure they can't do it, so we don't need to worry, okay? In fact, I mean, I can make this argument too right now. You know, the Chinese military has missed 2 generations of warfare, and we shouldn't worry about Taiwan because we have no evidence that they can pull off a large-scale amphibious operations, arguably the most complex type of operation to try to pull off. And so if you think as an analyst you can just walk into a room and tell people that we have nothing to worry about because we haven't seen them do it before, we don't know if they can do it, and we don't know based on their exercise if those exercises are really sufficiently dynamic or good enough that will enable them to conduct this operation, there's a reasonable argument to make.
I heard it.
Yeah. I think I've made it myself before at some rooms, just as a devil's advocate, because it's correct. It is also correct that these are the type of arguments, in some extent, some folks made about the Japanese in the run-up to Pearl Harbor. Okay, and it is also true that while often that assessment might be right, if you get it wrong, the risk of getting it wrong, the risk of under-devastation, for example, Israel's failure to properly estimate the ability and intent of Hamas on October 7th, despite having fairly good intelligence of it, incorrect interpretation of it, can be disastrous, can be absolutely disastrous. And so whenever people criticize and say the tendency to worst case, is problematic, I'll say, listen, if your worst case things in the analysis, you get it wrong and things turn out better than you expected, yes, sure, you'll be criticized. But believe me, if you get it wrong and actually they can do it, and it's a lot worse than you think, the consequences are far worse of being a failure to be prepared for that.
That's also a very human cognitive bias. Nobody likes to think about terrible things too much. That's why we don't think about war that much in peacetime.
Well, yeah. But in defense analysis, this is what you have to think about in peacetime.
Yeah. But
so
the Russian military.
So Russian military, definitely they were missing the software and the ability to translate theory into practice and scale. And that was clear, although they evolved considerably over the course of this war. And I think in that area, I think they certainly improved in terms of being able to execute recon fire, recon strike, dynamic targeting, employment of precision-guided weapons, what have you.
Which ironically was supposed to be their forte when it started, the complex of reconnaissance strike, which we talked a lot about it at the early stages of the war.
Yes. And
paradoxically, now they tend to be quite good at it, but not so much in the beginning.
Yes, now they're good at the thing they couldn't do at the beginning and that we thought they would be good at. Yes. And second, the overall quality of the force. It was very hard to tell because the Russian military does basic training quite different from us in the United States, where a lot of this is done at the individual unit, brigade, division, what have you. And so there wasn't a good way to have a sense of what the actual force quality was, what the quality of junior leadership was, and could that force actually execute a lot of these things or not. And I saw that they had real problems with the fundamentals in terms of the quality of the force and basic level of training, basic soldiering, junior leadership, and to some folks, they always thought this about the Russian military, but I didn't because I was kind of part of the generation of analysts who saw how poor the Russian military both was and how poorly it performed in the 1990s and in 2000s.
Meaning in Chechnya?
Yeah, both the Chechen wars and in general the decrepit state of the Russian military and efforts to stabilize it, but then also saw views really lag of the Russian armed forces between the Russia-Georgia war in 2008 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2014. And then after that, it took some more time for those views to evolve, right? Because you saw the Russian intervention in Syria in 2015 and folks being very skeptical that anything would come of the Russian operation. And they were wrong about that too. So there was actually visible overcorrection in our field of analysis. And the overcorrection was for lagging views of the Russian armed force. Because back then, senior leaders were very dismissive of the Russian military still. And several calls were gotten wrong, like the 2014 invasion, the 2015 intervention in Syria. Then there was a degree, I think, of overcorrection in assuming that the Russian military had progressed further than they had. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that it was due to an attempt to finally shift the perceptions of the Russian armed forces from something that can easily be dismissed to, hey, this is a problem we do have to deal with, both in Europe and not just in Europe, also in the Middle East. Oh, look, and also here. Oh, now they are going to deploy to Libya too, and Wagner's there are going to be supported by Russian general staff, and so on and so forth. Meaning the problem began to be, for lack of a better word, cancerous, And so there was a degree of, I think, overcorrection in terms of what we thought they could do, because it's quite difficult to assess force quality, right? You're not there. It's not like you're sitting there looking at their basic training, going to the exercise. There's some degree you have to estimate or make some assumptions.
Well, that's the big oscillation. That's something you said in the early podcast in the war. I think it's like we had to say that the Russian army wasn't a 10-foot giant, and now we're going to have to say that it's not a 10 inches midget or something.
Yeah. The way I used to put it was basically say that for prior to this war, for a long time, I would just kept explaining to people that the Russian military is not 12 feet tall, and since the failure of the full-scale invasion, views quickly got shaped very far in other extreme directions. And I said that for the next many years, I can tell my life is going to be explaining to them that the Russian military is not 4 feet tall either, that it's neither of these two caricatures. Maybe it's 5 foot, 3 inches or something like that. But
maybe it's just average, which is hard to imagine coming from the Red Army. It's hard to think that, they're average, they're flawed in very common ways, actually. And, when you have a war, this kind of bad things happen when you're not fully prepared. It's just like that. They are not overpowerful. They're not underwhelming either.
Yeah, this is like that kind of powerful quote that often gets attributed to Bismarck, but he probably didn't say it because most quotes that don't have an origin get attributed to Bismarck, that Russia is never as strong or as weak as she looks, right? I think it's also attributed to Metternich or several other people. There's like a traditional basket of historical leaders that quotes get attributed to.
In France, we have de Gaulle.
Yeah, I'm sure, but it gotta be. De Gaulle probably said it too. So yeah, this is a fairly balanced way to look at it. And
so that's the Russian army. What you learn, and I'll ask you later what it's like to see the army you studied disappear in a few months also. But on the other hand, what did you learn about the Ukrainian army, which you were not an expert on, but not many people were? What did you learn? So obviously we learned a lot about their will to fight, their resistance, and all that. But not even technically. Was this just a successful guerrilla in the first months?
No, not at all. But the Russian army, the only last thing I would add is I definitely saw that the... we knew much about advanced capabilities, force structure, all this, but another thing I basically saw was that they had made big trade-offs in force structure in the way they designed their military, and they cut the infantry component of the force. They reduced readiness to get larger, more and more formations on paper. And these are trade-offs militaries make, right, between capability, capacity, and readiness. And that many of those trade-offs actually made them very poorly positioned to sustain this war, if anything went wrong, which pretty much all of it did for them. And I think that we did not do a good enough job, I certainly speak of myself here, in thinking through the implications of their force design choices for their performance. And so since then, as an analyst, I've been harping on this point because we talk way too much about capabilities and we don't talk nearly enough about force structure and how that's shaped by military strategy and doctrine and what the force is actually designed to do, and think like, okay, well, is that force, based on how it's designed and the trade-offs they've made, will it do well in this type of war if it wasn't necessarily built with this war in mind, right? And because there's also a tendency in defense, particularly defense planning circles, not maybe so much defense local, but certainly defense planning circles, to assume that a military built for some kind of large war can handle all the other wars. And intuitively, that seems right, but historically, it's often wrong. Like, a military built to fight in Europe is not necessarily going to do great in counterinsurgency in Iraq. Like, you know this, right? A military built to fight a conventional war will not necessarily do well in Afghanistan, okay? A military built for one particular battle in the Pacific may not do great in a very different type of war, even if it's a lesser case war. Okay, maybe it has the capabilities, the resources to adjust and adapt to it, but often defense planners make the argument that if we handle the large-scale scenario, we should be able to handle all the smaller ones, but it's often not true. All right. And that's something. But also there are certain trade-offs we didn't know about. Like, I actually did not know the extent to which they cut infantry and readiness levels until we saw the manning tables from captured documents. And then, for those interested in an article, Not Fit for Purpose on Russian force design, it's something I wrote with Rob Lee fairly early into the war in 2022, once we felt we had enough primary sources together, where we could put together the unit composition, the order of battle, and see what the manning levels were. And we did discover a bunch of things we did not know about the Russian military. Hence my comment about, I don't think it's necessarily easier to be a military historian, but it's much easier to look back and have all this and say, aha, certainly this is something, that now explains it. But at the time, we didn't know this. We didn't know this until we actually had the evidence. Sorry, about the Ukrainian military. I knew some things about the Ukrainian military, but I would not describe, and I think it's very unfair to call myself an expert in the Ukrainian armed forces, and there was very little investment in the U.S. defense research ecosystem in the study of the Ukrainian military, or even in the study of lessons from 2014 and 2015. I was a principal investigator on a RAND report, Lessons from Combat Operations in Crimea and I think Eastern Ukraine, if that's the title. It was some years back that came out. That was one of the research publications I did back then on it. But I wouldn't say there was a great deal of interest on the subject, disappointingly to me. And I think, we learned a tremendous amount about the Ukrainian military. They also learned quite a bit about themselves too, because you find whatever you believe, you find out a lot of things at the opening of a major war, an existential war like this. No, the Ukrainian military was actually a fairly sizable force. It was a force, I think, with almost 27 maneuver brigades deployed, with National Guard, a reserve, a number of artillery brigades, a tactical missile brigade, and also the largest park of ground-based radar-guided air defense in Europe, realistically, if you look at all the air defense capabilities they had. So the challenge from my point of view was they're looking at the way the force was concentrated in the raid. For example, there were no regular Ukrainian Army units north of Kiev at the time of the invasion, from when the Russian forces were coming from Belarus, just to put that out there, right? There was Ukraine's 1st Tank Brigade in Chernihiv with some support in National Guard and territorial defense units, but not much else on the northeastern side of that either. And the readiness level of Ukrainian forces, right in the run-up to invasion wasn't that high. So there were all sorts of reserves hadn't been deployed. Mobilization hadn't been ordered until the very last kind of moments. So a lot of kind of questions like, okay, well, how would this force then effectively defend? What's their plan? And if this is their plan, why are the units not positioned where they ought to be? Why are the air defenses not scattered? And a lot of this really came together, I think, in the last 24 hours. This is a much longer story, and I'm not going to do justice here, so I don't want to tell it here and basically incorrectly or superficially. But I learned a great deal about the Ukrainian armed forces, I think, over the course of this war.
So would you say the plan was not good, but the reaction when it was coming was good?
Yeah, once the Ukrainian military went into action, bolstered by many Ukrainian volunteers who helped stall the Russian advance, the initiative and the motivation of Ukrainian commanders and troops, I think in many respects, is responsible for their ability to initially defeat, for lack of a better word, the Russian plan, which had very strict timetables and was heavily leveraged towards speed of action. Then Russian forces were overextended, not prepared for a sustained fight, didn't secure ground lines of communication, and the Russian military advanced on so many axes that it was effectively competing itself for logistics, for supplies, and actually had few concentration of forces in most areas. And that gave Ukraine a relative advantage, and what was decisive early on actually was traditional artillery fire. Ukraine has significant fires advantage at the point of contact. and in some cases had a substantial forcing advantage too, even though Russian forces had the initial initiative and an element, to some extent, element of surprise. Nonetheless, once Ukrainian forces contained and stabilized the situation, you could see very quickly that the Russian military was in deep trouble and it was effectively defeated both in the north and the south. Folks are well aware of the defeat around Kiev and Russian force retreat from there. But also quite significant was the defeat of Russian forces in around Kharkiv and Russian ability to effectively penetrate there, and the defeat of Russian force around Voznesensk, which is north of Nikolaev. Okay, so if you look at Nikolaev and you look at the Russian attempts to basically break through the city and then to get around it, they were also defeated in the south and had no path to Odessa. Right, so it was a series of defeats that they suffered.
And how has it evolved? So obviously you have much more contact with the Ukrainian army than with the Russian one, since you go there quite often. How? I think I heard you say that you go there every 3 months or so.
Yeah, about 3.5 months. Yeah.
So how has it evolved?
Well, I think that's a short way to answer that question.
No, okay, well. No, but there's a question, interesting question about researchers, Western researchers coming to Ukraine and what they show you and how they explain it to you and what you understand and what you come back with. And so maybe take us through, how does it work?
When you say how does it work, are you asking me about how does field work work, or are you asking me specifically about kind of my experiences following Ukraine first?
Well, I think both are pretty linked.
Yeah. So first, the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian force evolved very significantly from the start of the war. Right? From, if you look at mobilization, the expansion of Ukrainian armed forces, also the process of attrition, right? The fact that both militaries aren't fighting with the army that they started the war with, from both people and equipment point of view. They changed the way the forces were organized. They've changed the force structure. They've changed command and control, the actual C2 organization of the fight, and a lot of technology deployed, tactics change, and the battlefield dynamics change, right? If the war started off as a classic sort of war of combined arms maneuver, infantry, mechanized formations, and artillery, then evolved further as a war where artillery fires correlation or asymmetry was a very significant determining factor in outcomes. Then it shifted from that much more into a positional war, which is a fairly natural evolution, right, from an initial dynamic, intense period of maneuver to then a prolonged period of positional warfare, one that's characterized by high levels of attrition. As both militaries dig in, and it becomes much harder to overcome a prepared defense. Force density increase, you get minefields, you get traditional defenses. Then each side tries to establish some degree of advantage to conduct offensive operations, see if it can achieve a breakthrough. We've seen this before, kind of this pattern in conventional wars. And then both sides focus on technological adaptation, tactical adaptation, and then try to evolve operational concepts to see if they can find a way to fight differently. And you see the Ukrainian military really changing the way it fights, now emphasizing drones and drone warfare and drone units as the kind of principal engine in their approach to this war. The Russian military has gone through several evolutions, from focusing on achieving fire superiority with artillery, to larger scale mechanized assaults, to grinding infantry assaults, to this year focusing on infiltration as a form of maneuver, and basically investing in small scale offensive operations with very tiny numbers, really, of men, but high in daily intensity and on a broad front, right? The Russian military is effectively enabled to conduct large-scale combat operations in this war, both because of force quality issues and because they can't overcome Ukraine's prepared defense backed by mass precision. But if you look at Ukrainian armed forces and kind of dealing with them, I know I'll get to your question, but I want to give people like a very quick taste of how things have changed. And from my point of view, they tend to change almost every maybe 3, 4, 5 months. And that's part of the reason why I tend to go with a sort of operational tempo, right? On the one hand, you can't just be there all the time because you're not necessarily learning anything new, and it's dangerous and you're getting in the way, right? So you don't want to just be there. I'm not a fan of war tourism, and I'm always wary that, and I always tell people this about field work. if it's important for you to find something out, if you really think you want to do it and you can do it, then do consider it, right? But I also discourage people because this is dangerous, you can get killed, and you shouldn't just go because you're seeking adventure and thrills either. That's not what this really is. And you should be careful because wars have a tendency to suck you in, right? So if you spend too much time there, if you forget why you're there for analysis, you're there for research, okay? You may support the Ukrainian military, but you're there for a reason, right?
And with the topic in mind. If you don't have one, you don't see anything.
Yeah. You're there, and you're trying to figure out specific things, okay? And in each trip, I have maybe a different focus on like gaps we're trying to fill. Beyond the traditional, like, okay, how are things evolved over the last 3.5 months? What's different now from what it was before about how the Russian military fights, about how Ukrainian military fights, and the tactical situation, like how the things develop. That's a typical thing you're trying to get an update. And here's the way I kind of approach it. First, always, working alongside the Ukrainian military with their permission, their access, right? Just to be clear with folks. Also, never one that I've never been professionally one that likes to be shown or taken anywhere. My approach is that we have a clear sense of what parts of the front want to see, what kind of folks want to engage on, and are able to do that and coordinate that with Ukrainian forces. So I've never been one to go on the merry-go-round ride, so to speak. If this makes sense.
But the Ukrainian military is a very complex organization which happens to be centralized and also very decentralized.
It's very decentralized.
But for something it's good to go from the top, and for some things you can have direct contact with brigades commanders and so on. So how do you approach it? Do you approach it with units you want to focus on, you happen to know someone in, and then you go from there, or do you, ask for general permission, then it goes where it goes?
So here's what I'll say. First, it's important to engage at the military strategic level, the senior military leadership and political leadership, to understand their perspective, because they have the context, okay? Although they don't have the ground truth of what's really happening at the front, not necessarily.
So that's in Kiev, typically.
Well, let's say senior military leadership has a perspective, they have the context, but there's a lot of things about the tactical details of the fight that they may not know, right? Second, it's very important to then engage at the level of command along an operational axis or with brigade commanders, because they have a very important perspective on the fight and what their unit's doing, what they're trying to do. They're also managing the force, so they're close to issues dealing with personnel, equipment, material, and those realities, right? Next, it's also important to get down to that battalion command level or company commander or artillery battery commander as well. And you have to engage with different units, because a maneuver brigade has one perspective on the fight. The artillery brigade supporting them might have another. The drone unit supporting them might also have a very good, valid perspective on the fight, right? The folks working air defense in the same sector or doing intercepting drones, they also have a perspective on the fight or like the particular thing that they're working on. And you need all those parts of the picture. You can't just go to an infantry battalion and say, all right, what's been happening here, and say, this is what the war must be like along this part of the front. Because you didn't talk to any of the other people doing other jobs. And you need to talk to several units. You can't just go to one unit and ask them what happened. Sure, their experience is very valid, but the unit left and right of them has an important part of the story, and they're going to fill in gaps for you, right? They're going to tell you other things. So this takes time, and for an effort to be valid to the extent that you can do it, you have to go first to different parts of the front line, because the geography is different and the character of the fight is different where you are on such a broad front.
And you can move around freely, somewhat freely?
Yeah, absolutely. Free at your own risk, yeah? I'll put it that way. This is a conventional war. This is not a,
But you don't have to be drawn around by some Ukrainian personnel or not?
Never have been.
Okay. Stupid question, but
no, it's a perfectly fair one.
What language do you speak?
I'm not much in the business of being driven around.
Yeah. Well. Do you speak Ukrainian or do you speak English? Because I suppose I know you travel sometimes with Rob Lee, which is another great analyst.
Yep.
I don't know if he speaks Ukrainian. So my question is, do you speak English or Ukrainian with the people on the ground?
It's honestly a real mix. So I understand Ukrainian, particularly the language of my profession, which is not just the language of typical common conversational, but also, more importantly, the military technical terms you need to speak. Because when you're engaging with military folks, you need to know the terminology of your profession in that language, on top of being conversational in it. And you have to know the mannerisms, you have to know the slangs, and you need to know those specifics, which are critical. That I understand, I think, quite well. Obviously, as I'm sure you know, I also speak Russian. I'm originally from Kiev and had maintenance, I think decent maintenance, not nearly as much in Ukrainian as I wish I had, but it's gotten much better over the course of my work in Ukraine.
No, but why I'm asking is because obviously people react differently when someone talks to them in their own language and make the effort or has made the effort to invest in that. And to some Western researcher that wants to talk about everything in English doesn't have the same level of familiarity with people that are on the ground, that are risking their lives and might want or not want to discuss what they're doing.
So what I'll say is that if you don't have language proficiency and you just speak English, unless you have a translator with you, it will not be nearly as successful or a rewarding experience. And more importantly, it's not just about speaking the language, it's understanding the culture, understanding something of the history, and knowing how to engage with people, right? Even if I don't speak French, okay, but I'm a big fan of France. I don't speak French.
If you told me you spoke French all this time, I would be
I
very
would be
upset
surprised. It would be a disappointing podcast. About halfway through it, I was like, "Did you just want to do this in French?" But it would be funny. It would be funny, but no, there would be a surprising plot twist to this discussion.
Yeah.
No, but even if I did, right? Let's say tomorrow, hypothetically, I suddenly learned French and. Maybe not to the satisfaction of Parisians, but nonetheless, let's say I finally spoke it. But I still, even just having the language, I would not know or understand French culture because I hadn't grown up here. No, I had never spent any time here, and I wouldn't be a person who's of France, right? I just speak the language. And the language by itself is very important as a communication tool, but it's not the full skill set you need to have. It helps to have experience working on the region. This is where having some area studies background, where not just being a defense analyst as a generalist, to me is important. I'm not saying you have to have it. I'm just saying this is also why I travel with a mixed group of analysts. Myself, Rob Lee, Franz Stefan Gatti, and Konrad Muzyka, right? Franz is Austrian, Konrad is Polish. They're all good military analysts. Rob is a fellow American. And everyone brings very interesting skill sets, perspectives, and the older people in your group will ask questions you hadn't thought of, and they're interested in different things. So it's not just sort of my effort, is an effort of several analysts, and I like what everyone brings to the team, and they're from different countries, right? So, maybe I have certain interests or certain biases as someone who's a product of the U.S. defense establishment, but my colleague from Austria would not, or my colleague from Poland would not. Or if you came along from France, you might ask a different set of questions, right? Your interests would be different. So for me, it's important to have a couple different folks always in a conversation.
And it's it's actually an important question. Do you have insurance?
For what?
For going there?
Do I have insurance?
Yeah, because I know it's actually a very big block for a lot of Western researchers that would like to go to Ukraine, who would like to do field trips, but whose institutions cannot allow them because they have no insurance, they don't have any cover if anything happens to them, which might not be an issue when you come from the US. I don't know, but I know that it's a very big block for a lot of Western researchers to go to Ukraine.
So for a long time I did this, I didn't. The last 2 years since I moved to Carnegie, I do. To be honest, I probably have never spent that much time thinking about. Let me put it this way: when I started doing this, for a long time, I started doing this. I did not have insurance, and I don't think my colleagues did either. I'm sure on the one hand, it's important. You'd want to have that.
It's not important for you necessarily. It might be important for the institution that employs you.
Yes. Let's
say Americans have maybe a little different relationship to insurances than we do.
No, some institutions require it. Others wouldn't. But I've made it work both with and without.
No, but So since we're on the topic, I wanted to ask you maybe 3 things you learned of a particular note from your last field trip in Ukraine. What are 3 things that interested you, specifically the last time you went, which was, if I'm not mistaken, in August, since you did...
Late July, end of July.
You did a 3-parter with Rob Lee on the Russia Contingency, which is remarkable on what you learned in this trip. So what are 3 things you recorded, so to speak?
Sure. So if I think, first how the dynamic change in terms of Ukrainian defense and Russian cognitive offensive operation, Ukrainian forces were essentially increasingly arrayed as pickets, and the forward positions weren't really holding terrain. It was partly due to scarcity of manpower and low density of forces relative to terrain on the ground, and a strong emphasis on zone defense with drones, both forward and behind the forward positions.
That's one. Just interrupt. Say that's one of the fascinating things, that at the early stages of the war, everybody was focused on World War I and the trenches and the lines and how everybody digs and all that. And, well, now it comes as something totally different, because Russians can infiltrate one by one because there are no trenches, there are no fixed line of defenses. It's much more...
Well, nobody's in those, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but so one thing they learned, and I think it's important, is there was an image of the war that it's World War I trenches but with drones and all this technology on top of it. And it became clear, based on observation, a lot of experience Ukrainian forces, that that's not the case at all, actually. There's nobody in trenches. There's no forces holding large numbers of trenches. In fact, what's happening is Ukraine has a series of forward pickets. Those pickets don't control terrain around them. The Russian forces infiltrate because they walk through them. And the primary objective of Russian forces is not to attack Ukrainian forward positions either, but to bypass them, right? Hence, I speak about infiltration as the form of maneuver being selected by them, using terrain, maybe using thermal cloaks, or maybe just using tree lines. Ukrainian forces effectively trying to defeat them with mines, artillery, and mostly drones. But the interaction between two forces making it actually very difficult to map who controls what. Because then the forward line of troops increasingly is not a forward line of troops because it's not a line, right? It's you sort of see it on the map, but it's more of a gray zone of an overlapping set of fire control zones by yours and enemy drones, right? And in parts of the line or parts of a tree line, there are places in Ukraine where in a tree line there could be a 2-3 man position on one side of it that's Ukrainian and a 3-man Russian position on the other side that's Russian. And you tell me who controls this tree line, or nobody controls this tree line, right? So
yeah, well,
but this is real.
It's the time to say that war mappers do a great job from the beginning of the war, but that job is becoming increasingly difficult.
Very difficult. In fact, we have folks sometimes have to think that military analysts that we sort of have consensus group thing. We do not. And I have many colleagues that work on this, and on the OSINT side of the community, the professional military analyst community, and behind the scenes, we have lots of debates. They're incredibly nerdy. You would not benefit from hearing them at all, trust me. Or maybe you would. I'm not sure your audience, but
I would.
But it would. Yeah, it's it's not the kind of information that will really help you in life. But we have lots of debates that are narcissism of small differences over how do we actually do the mapping? How do we know what we know? How do we make a judgment call? Who controls what? At one point, a couple of months ago, we had a lively debate amongst colleagues, like, what is the difference between an advance, a breach, a breakthrough? Does a breakthrough only exist at operational level, or can there be a tactical breakthrough? What is the requirements for a breakthrough? Momentum, exploitation, what are we talking about? And different folks have different interpretations of what these words even mean. And I'm back and forth, why did you call it this versus why did I call it that? You know? And okay, sorry for this detour, but so we increasingly debate what do we see.
It's actually extremely important, because this is the step one which shapes the whole discourse around the war since day one.
Yeah.
Everybody takes from the same maps from day one. So the question of who makes those maps and how do they make it is actually very important, even though a bit nerdy.
Right. And I know not all, but I think most of the people that make these maps and a lot of the folks involved in the conversation. So it's very interesting to see the discussions and debates that approach. But yeah, so increasingly, like, for example, around Dobropilye, Pokrovsk, it's very hard for folks to say, well, who controls what? Or is this just, should we just make this gray? And just say we're not sure it's contested? You know, like how should we judge this? And and to be like, okay, well, if there are Ukrainian positions here and Russian positions commingled with them, why should we paint that red, or why should we paint that blue? Should we just have it be gray? Okay, and then similar in towns, like for urban battles where you have folks embedded and they're holding positions, they're not firing positions. They're in basements and in different buildings and they're entrenched. Let's say Toretsk. And the forces are commingled where in one block it's Ukrainians, another block it's Russians, another block it's Ukrainians. Who controls the center of Toretsk, and how do you determine this at this point, right? This becomes almost like a metaphysical exercise of you trying to gauge and imagine who's in which basement. How would you know? Sorry, I'm just discussing some of the challenges in assessing these things. But okay, so
first thing is the non-holding positions by the Ukrainians,
right?
Zone defense, so sort of zone defense,
right, and just the way Russians changed their typical assault with infantry to focus much more on infiltration, right, and even smaller numbers of forces penetrating the Ukrainian military, but at a high rate of intensity. Imagine instead of a platoon attacking on mounted, right, on armored fighting vehicles and being dropped off by 4 armored fighting vehicles and being dismounted with the vehicles retreating, which is the way things used to happen a lot in 24-23, to now, let's say, imagine you have a platoon-sized force, but it's actually individual groups of 2 infantrymen, each one as their own fire team, okay, and all of them advancing 2 by 2, 2 by 2, along multiple paths, and essentially you are facing many, many distributed small infantry attacks with those individuals being quickly replaced if they are killed in action or wounded. Another group of 2 takes their place. Second, the interaction between how Ukrainian drone units have evolved in Ukrainian defensive line of drones and Russia deploying its own offensive line of drones, the use of Rubicon formations, as both a training and development center and also a series of elite formations backing the Russian military, and how Ukrainian forces...
So the Rubicon Center is a very well-known sort of elite unit, which has been located, I think, by some journalists recently. Basically, they are the high-performing drone units in the Russian military, which doesn't have that many, but apparently it's been said by the Ukraine that if the Russians had more Rubicon units, it would be actually very difficult because they are high-performing.
Yeah, so the work you're referring to, I think, is by Mark Krudov and his colleagues at RFERL. Rubicon is both a training development center, so it has a pipeline for developing drones, drone munitions, and procurement alongside with it, right, supply chain with it. Also a center for training elite drone crews in Russia, and a series of company-sized drone formations, think, over 100 men or so, assigned to regional groupings of troops and deployed along the key operational axis, with several of these formations, let's say, operating in Donetsk or other places. And yeah, they've created some challenges for Ukrainian forces, which enjoyed some considerable advantages in drone warfare and employing drone units as their principal offset to Russia's material and manpower advantage. That's been interesting to track as well. And
I'll add that in the 3-parter with Rob Lee that you had this summer, the second episode is on drones, and really fascinating on how fiber optics drones changed the driving of the drones and the way you have to think about the trajectory of your drone and what it can do and what it cannot do.
Yeah.
And apparently that's all very new and that's very changing. And since the drones do the majority of casualties on the front, that's actually very important to understand what's happening on the front. But I'll leave the listeners to listen to it, to get a subscription and then listen to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to focus on, we do cover some of this as always on the main War on the Rocks podcast as well, which is free and open to all. We don't do it as frequently in War on the Rocks because it also covers other issues. Beyond the Russia-Ukraine war, there's, other wars and other national security issues.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Israel had a real go at Iran not long ago. Who knows where we'll be some months from now. But so folks know it's not just like, you have to subscribe to Russia Contingency paid podcast. But yeah, normally when we do this field trip, we do have one on the situation where we learn them. We have another kind of nerdy deep dive into the drone and tech side. So on the tech side, very briefly, for example, fiber optic cable drones, which really kind of entered skilled employment in Ukraine when Russians began using them in Kursk against Ukrainian forces there in the Kursk salient. And then they quickly spread across the line, and Russian forces continuously improved them, so the range of them became much longer and longer. And then it started to lead Russian forces to employ them as part of a much more positional approach where they would seek to create envelopments, that is, put Ukrainian forces into a pocket and then use long-range fiber optic cable drones to try to cut the ground lines of communication logistics and then displace the forces from that pocket, which is kind of what happened at Kursk. That's how Kursk essentially ends. And so
do the infamous Kessel, the envelopment, and cut the base of the cauldron and then force the retreat.
Something like that. They've obviously not been successful doing it in other parts of the front line, like what happened in Kursk. But if you look at the front line, it is increasingly looking like a series of salients running all the way north to, south and west along the front. The other thing I want to mention, though, is although there's all this conversation on drones, I think that's also important to nuance it, right? One of the things I try to do is provide context. So folks get these numbers that drones inflict 70, 80% of the loss in the war at this point. That's true, but with a couple of asterisks next to that number. And it's also important to say that because of that, the casualty ratio changed substantially, where the number of killed in action has gone up considerably, but the number of wounded in action ratio has decreased considerably. So that actually, if the war started out and maybe the KA to WA wounded in action ratios were something like, let's say, 1 to 4 or 1 to 3.5 or something like that, then now it's much closer to 1 to 1 because the injuries inflicted are so severe by drones, there's zero chance of being evacuated or close to zero chance of being evacuated from the front line to fire control. And
actually, very different wounds too. There's a great argument to be made that the whole individual protection of the soldier has to be rethought entirely because, well, it's not just only the chest wounds and the head wounds that are dangerous now because drones might explode at your feet. But if you, well, anyway, but there's a great reflection to be had on what drone-inflicted wounds have to mean to change the individual equipment.
Yeah, if you get hit by a drone drop munition or an FPV that hits you directly, well, I don't know what personal protection will really protect you from an FPV given the size of the munition, but it's quite different from the type of wounds that were inflicted in earlier periods of war where the main principal means of fire support was artillery. And artillery fire inflicts a lot of wounded. But it also inflicts quite a bit of lightly wounded or shrapnel wounds, which is very different than folks being hit by drones. And also being hit by drones at a point of the line from which it's very difficult to extract anyone during the critical time period where you could save somebody, right? So you're going to get far more killed, and you're also going to get far less wounded as a ratio to those killed, right? Who are surviving wounded as well. But not to get too detoured down that conversation, what I would say is that folks have to understand that drones have become so significant not only because of the technology itself, but because we've had now several years of warfare that is highly positional and routinized along relatively static lines, not completely, but fairly much more static. And drone units can deploy. They know where to expect enemy attacks, but most importantly, mines, traditional air defense, and artillery really shape the dynamic in the battlefield to make the drones effective. One thing I found from the last trip is actually employment of artillery and use of artillery ammunition hadn't substantially decreased in Ukrainian forces, which you think is a pretty strange finding, right? If you also believe that 80% of the attrition is inflicted by drones, then you must assume that artillery ammunition use has declined precipitously, which you're not. Mm-hmm. But it hasn't. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So first, drones continue to struggle to work in poor weather and high wind conditions. And the Russians will typically attack when the weather's bad. And there you're back to depending on artillery. Second, artillery has very important shaping and canalizing effects, right? You can't just dismiss on the battlefield because if you don't have artillery, you wouldn't have Russian forces attacking in small infantry groups, okay? Artillery, especially DPICM, cluster munition, artillery shells, are very, very effective at preventing the opponent from concentrating their assault or massing.
For example, a mechanized unit that would assemble and then could be hit by artillery fire.
Sure, but equally importantly, this was an obvious reason why you don't see company or platoon-sized assault by Russian infantry the way North Koreans tried to do it early on in December. It's because you will quickly get the formation decimated with artillery fire as opposed to drones, right? Because drones inflict effective point damage. And also artillery is much less used now against infantry because if the enemy is attacking with 2-3-man infantry groups, you're not going to use artillery shells for them. That's the reality. You're not going to start firing artillery at 2 infantrymen walking, right? So you're going to send drones to hit that target.
Too expensive and too imprecise.
Correct. It doesn't make much sense, right? You don't have any concentration of manpower equipment to hit with artillery, and 2 men firing artillery shells, which you don't have in great availability at 2 infantrymen walking, doesn't make great sense, right? Next, artillery is also very important for effectively suppressing forces delivering volume of fires. They're very important when you're doing a counterattack because drones still don't deliver this effect, and troops' morale really goes up when they see artillery coming into the fight. And especially if they have to attack, because when you see drones hit the tree line, great. Maybe they had an effect, maybe something happened. You don't know. But if you're doing a counterattack and you see artillery hit a tree line, you think, hey, the enemy must be suppressed. That looked pretty bad. Your morale goes up if you're the one that has to do the assault, right? Similarly, they also open up tree lines which drones often can't see. So they're very helpful in a lot of ways. And basically the reason I'm saying is I don't want folks to think that, okay, it's just drones now, all these other things don't matter, and not understand that it's a combination of things that have led to this prevailing dynamic, right? And same thing with mines. Drones are used to put down mines, but many vehicles and a lot of infantry are defeated by mines, right, and by minefields. And so it's a combination of all these means.
And so we derailed completely, but you had maybe a third thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not a third thing, but we can have a third or a fourth thing. The fourth for me is probably at the end of the day, the importance of what I consider to be the fundamentals, like force generation, force management, and trying to organize command and control. So on the Russian side, what I clearly saw is that the Russian military continues to make plans, right, by armies or corps, but the force tactically can't execute on them. It lacks the force quality. The way they are fighting is a very inefficient way to try to attain those goals, and they still continue to struggle to overcome Ukrainian defenses backed by mass precision, the zonal defense. And whether they try infiltration tactics with infantry or lightly motorized attacks with motorcycles or buggies, what I kind of call the Mad Max approach. Folks laugh at it. It's so on the one. Okay,
well,
it's okay. First, it's surprisingly in some cases it's made better gains for them than traditional mechanized assaults because the Ukrainian military optimized to defeat traditional mechanized assault, which was costly and effective for the Russian military. On the other hand,
I think people laugh because it doesn't look like a good idea on the front.
So can I say something? I like the visuals of it because I've had to deal for 3.5 years of folks saying that traditional armored fighting vehicles are vulnerable to drones and that maybe we should get out of tanks and get out of infantry fighting vehicles, to which I would say, and get into what? Toyota Hilux with a Dishka, like what should we all get into? A dune buggy, maybe a motorcycle. And finally, the Russian military showed what would happen if you did that. And now we can present this visually to folks who think that complex land weapon systems are old hat, they're obsolete, drones have made them irrelevant, and offensive operations should be done in something lighter, cheaper, that's either much more expendable or whatnot. And here we go. Now we can see what it looks like. And it's a great visual counter argument to their proposition that we should fight in dune buggies or whatever it was. And the same thing folks will say like tanks are obsolete or any other vehicle that. So by the way, it's interesting a conversation on how you interpret data. In any war you look at, you'll see high rates of losses of particular types of equipment, and you can look at that and say this means that this stuff is vulnerable to obsolete. Or you can only say the reason you have high rates of loss of types of equipment is because it's the most used, and therefore it is the most relevant to the way the two sides are fighting. So it's just a question of local interpretation of data from the war. Yeah, no, the fourth one goes back to the importance of training, force regeneration, manpower, how hard it is to restore your force once you've lost the better part of your force in terms of personnel and equipment, and the criticality of making good decisions on force management, which are important. They're important trade-offs. Okay, let's say you have a force that's deployed and it's stretched across the front line. You want to build an operational reserve, right? You want to be able to pull units off the line and rotate them. Well, what do? You can continue expanding the formations you have, make the brigades and even larger, right? Or you can try to create new brigades. If you try to create new brigades, though, you're going to have a series of challenges. New brigades are not going to be combat effective at all. They're going to be freshly new. And if you create a new brigade, trying to think it's not going to be great unit for your reserve, and you rotate them off the line with an experienced unit that's holding it, guess what's going to happen when you put the new brigade on the line? That's where there's going to be a Russian, let's not say breakthrough, but a breach. Yeah. No. Yeah. Like that's immediately Russian forces will see it and they'll see this is a new brigade that has no idea what it's doing. It's never been on these positions before. In fact, during the rotations, the ideal time to attack. And sure as heck, they're going to try to take advantage of it, right? Second question, who do you give equipment to? Let's say you're going to train a new brigade and give Western equipment to the new brigade, which is likely to lose it in combat very easily because it's it's an experience that's led by folks who are new to the brigade. Or do you give it to an experienced unit that maybe detached a battalion for you to come train on, right? So these are important choices, right? And I would say that I've seen some good ones and I've seen some pretty bad ones over the course of this war. Lastly, on command. So one thing I continue to see is that technology is agnostic in terms of military culture and leadership style. So technology can enable different ways of fighting and different types of leadership, right? And you can see formations where the situational awareness that drones provide and the integration that you get in a command post enables the commander to then figure out what his formations need, help them succeed, and basically enable them in the fight that they're in. You see others where commanders see this as an opportunity to centralize command and control and micromanage everyone because now they can do it. They can see everything. They can call everyone in real time. And these folks are almost like a real-time strategy game for them. Now, finally, they can control all the units, and they can tell the company commander, the battalion commander, exactly what they should do, right? And different styles in between. So it reinforced to me the relevance of getting military culture right and getting the approach to leadership right, because technology by itself, like I said, is agnostic in this respect. And I was thinking through the key command layers, because despite this being perceived as a drone fight, you see the criticality of the platoon leader and the company commander and how a force deteriorates when it doesn't have good people in these roles, or it's lost too many experience for people in this role. You also see that above, let's say, the brigade or regimental command, the challenge you get if you don't have something like a divisional layer above them, enabling and tying the fight together, forcing then the folks to horizontally coordinate as best they can, right? The need to have a layer of command, especially if you want to conduct offensive operations. That's much harder to conduct offensive operations with a bunch of brigades kind of tying their effort together. You need something above that to make the effort more cohesive. I hope this kind of expansion makes sense. And that it always leads me, the technology is really interesting, but it always leads me back to conversations on force structure, organizational capacity, how you organize command and control. Why is a military fighting a certain way? Which adaptations are positive? Which adaptations are negative, where sometimes it's like that's an adaptation, but honestly, that's a crutch. And admiring the crutch is not the best way to go.
Mm. Maybe lastly, two things to look after in the coming months to gauge, if not the outcome of the war, but two useful indicators, according to you, on the ground.
Useful indicators on the ground. So first, I would say as we enter the winter around December, I think that the loss of terrain cover, foliage, should make Ukrainian units much more effective, since they're focused much more on drones as the principal means of defense, installing the Russian advance, and that we should have not an operational pause, but essentially a substantially reduced efficacy of Russian offensive efforts, probably from December to February, depending on what the weather actually is. For example, last year was incredibly warm. It's only when I was there in February, and it only started getting cold in the second week of February. So it's a remarkably warm winter in Europe. So the first is this going to hold true? Because the Russian offensive had been, notionally called by a number of folks in the media who, are colleagues, but sometimes structure a narrative that doesn't have a strong relationship to what's happening on the ground, that there's this Russian summer offensive. But the summer offensive actually began in March and hasn't ended in the summer. We are discussing it now in October. It's going to go through the fall. If it was in D.C., it would be a summer offensive because in D.C. summer does start in April and never ends. But so to me, if you look at both seasonal changes, degree of casualties and exhaustion of Russian forces, we should see a decrease in Russian offensive effort and its efficacy over the course of winter and probably pick back up sometime in late winter, early spring of 2026. It's my assumption. And partly because that's what happened last year, and of course it's wrong to extrapolate from a previous phase in the war, but nonetheless, I think that the reasons why that happened hold. Second thing I look for is, can Ukraine further evolve the organization of the drone units, which is what Madyar, the head of Unmanned Forces Command Ukraine, is trying to do, to stabilize the front line. Manpower continues to be a major problem for Ukraine, and it's increasingly clear that there are not great solutions that will be found for it, most likely in this war, okay? All right. That said, the Ukrainian military has nonetheless held Russia to incremental gains, and I think overall has performed quite well this year, and the situation this year is much better than many folks expected, and certainly much better than the Ukrainian military expected if we go back to the way things looked last fall, which was rather gloomy in terms of Russian
perspectives.
Yeah. Well, the Russian offensive effort was not only resulting in accelerated gains on the ground, but month to month from August to November, the rate of gain had increased considerably, and the situation was actually starting to look increasingly precarious heading into the winter. Folks remember that last year. So I think compared to where we were last year, the point we're at now is, to me, it's a much better place to be. But the thing I look for is, can Ukrainian drone forces actually stabilize the front line or not? What I saw from winter to summer, the answer was so far no, but there's an interaction, sort of Ukraine adaptation, the Russian counter-adaptation, and then Ukraine adaptation to the adaptation, and I don't know who's going to have the better of it. And obviously, it's going to be a continued contest. But I'm looking to see if Ukraine has a good second move in this. I think they do, but it's the kind of thing you need to come every several months to see how well this has evolved. I think they do, and I think that they'll be able to retain or retake the advantage over Russian drone units. But that to some extent remains to be seen. And I'm still going back and forth with myself. Like, as any analyst, I often have at least two opinions on a subject I debate with myself. On can a defensive effort oriented around these capabilities that I discussed and based around drone units effectively stabilize the front lines or not? Is it sustainable or not? Will this buy sufficient time for Ukrainian forces to exhaust Russian offensive potential if we give this another, 6, 8, 12 months, or will it not? These are the things I ask myself, and I try to find indicators that are useful to figure out which way it's going, like the things to look for.
And last question, the hardest and the worst. How does it end, according to you?
How does it end? Yeah,
please play the military historian that, you cannot be on this war, but how does it end?
No, I will. I found military historians really like being contemporary military analysts and commentators, so I'll play military historian for a turn.
From the future.
Huh?
The military historian from the future. How did this war end?
Yeah. So I actually am really glad that you phrased it that way, because I think it is absolutely the correct way to think about it. It's not the first to be frank, it's not the first time I've gotten this question. And it's a question actually commonly you get from senior political decision makers or military leaders. This is a question that they ask. I think sometimes to just see what you say, because none of us are, oracles that can know how war will end. But the reason why I'm glad you framed it this way is because the truth is that we don't know how it ends until we're looking back onto it from the future. And the reason for that is in the moment, however war ends, we will judge it one way. But we don't know what happens after that. For example, let's say there is a ceasefire, or let's say there's a peace settlement. If this proves durable, let's say there are some security commitments to Ukraine. Ukraine continues on as an independent and economically viable state without significant imposition on sovereignty, and there isn't a continuation of the war. There isn't a third Russia-Ukraine war. You will judge the matter in one way. Let's say you have the very same agreement, but a year or two after that, Russia relaunches the war. It doesn't invade in the way it did in 2022. This is one of Ukraine's leading concerns. It doesn't make those same mistakes. It's more successful, okay? Because let's say the Ukrainian military from this war had to be in large part demobilized. Experienced men left the armed forces after a year or two. And they weren't able to regenerate this capacity, this deployed force in sufficient time, right? Because it's a possibility. Because not all Europeans want to invest in keeping a Ukrainian army in the field after the war. That's part of the conversation being had right now in Europe, and I'm on one side of it. But let's say that happens. You will judge that peace and that ceasefire very differently, right? You will have a very different perspective on it, and you will see history judge it differently as well. So to some extent, we don't know until we have traveled some time's passed from how the war ends. My own point of view is that I see this war likely continuing at least for another 8 to 12 months. I think most people would agree with that assessment at this point. I'm increasingly seeing this as a war of diminishing returns for Russia as well, and I see sort of the apogee of Russian recruitment and availability of material, and also the growing costs for Russia as well. I don't see Russia winning this war. I think history will judge this war ultimately as a strategic failure for Russia. And that's an easy thing to say, both looking at their political objectives and the costs they've paid and where they're likely to end up. But also, we can't judge the matter until we see the agreement. Wars are contests of wills, not just between people, but between systems, between societies, between nations, however you want to put it. How a war ends gives you some indication of who imposed their will upon whom. And this is important. And until we see that, until we see how the war ends, we won't have all the pieces of the puzzles we need to effectively judge it, right? But we increasingly, I think, see the outlines of how this war can end. I think after the Alaska summit, we're probably further away from a ceasefire than we were before it. So I don't anticipate that to happen anytime soon. But to some extent, I also see that ending more and more on the horizon now as I look into 2026 than I did before. Maybe I'll be wrong about that. But to be frank, this isn't a dodge. I think this is, to me, more important to give people a way to think about this rather than a simple answer to say, oh, here, we can see the future will end like this. Because none of us truly know. I think it's better to think about this both from a historical perspective and also in terms of how we should judge that conclusion. We can judge on the basis of Russian goals or Ukrainian goals. We can judge on the basis of the cost paid, But it's not a conversation on how it ends. It's a conversation of sort of who wins or loses. I increasingly think that given how the war began, Russian maximalist objectives, the concerns and fears we had, the assumption that Ukraine would lose the conventional phase of the war, that as difficult of a place Ukraine is in, and given how much Ukraine has sacrificed, in many respects, we're somewhat fortunate to be at this place. Meaning, things from my point of view are far less precarious or dire than many folks had thought. and even looking back on last year and the trajectory of the world last year. So I hope this is kind of a less gloomy and more positive take on where we are, right?
That's a good place to end.
Yeah. I hope it's helpful.
It was. Thank you very much, Michael Kofman. So I'll obviously put links to your podcast, your productions, and also many of the articles that you quoted in the description of the episode. Thank you very much. Thank you to David Cadier from IRSEM who organized this trip, since you were there at IRSEM's invitation and you had many meetings in Paris, I think, during those few days. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting.